Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And this week, we're coming at you with two brand new reviews for two brand new records. This week, we're going to be talking about our thoughts on the newest album from one Miss PJ Harvey. We're going to be talking about I Inside the Old Year Dying. And we're also going to be talking about the latest album from Anohni and the Johnsons, My Back Was a Bridge for You to Cross.
Look at you nailing both of those difficult titles and artist names. Definitely not reading them. Well done. 100%. No, but you know what? Good. Because I think if I had that role, I would fuck up that PJ Harvey album title easily. Especially because there's a title
It's a bit
track.
of a mouthful.
There's a title track, but there's also a song called I Inside the Old I Dying, which is even more confusing. Anyway. All right, let's talk about this new PJ Harvey album first, because I think this is a really interesting record. It's a long, highly awaited record. It's PJ's first album in 7 years, since 2016's also underrated, the Hope 6 Demolition Project. And it is a record that comes off of the back of the release of her second collection of poetry, titled Orlum, which is heavily based. What it is, it's not really a collection of poetry. It's kind of a novel written in prose. And it's a story, essentially a coming of age story set in her home county of Dorset and written in the native tongue of Dorset as well. It's this kind of old English style, essentially, that is fairly archaic and takes a little bit of deciphering. I will admit that the Genius page for the songs on this album has been quite helpful in helping me to understand that when, for instance, Miss Harvey says Wordle, she does not mean the New York Times affiliate game, but actually means world. Yeah, and there's a lot of that on this record. There's a lot of kind of archaic Old English, but specifically Dorset tongue phrasing that harkens back to Polly's childhood and an older way of being, essentially, that you don't often get channeled into, certainly not releases as major as this in terms of the amount of press that this has gotten, in terms of the kind of stature of the artist. An obvious point of reference, if maybe one that's definitely different in a lot of ways, is Richard Dawson's album Peasant, which is also written pretty heavily in an Old English tongue, although mixed with very modern English in a way that is so Richard Dawson. He always does that kind of thing. So even that feels like a poor reference point for this. In fact, I struggle to really think of anything that this resembles in its approach and its sound and a lot of things that it does. And for that reason, it's a richly beguiling work. It's something that is so content existing within its own realm, within its own language, within its own space, and not really intent on capitulating that in any way to kind of offer a branch to the listener. You kind of have to commit yourself to this record, and you kind of have to commit time to unpacking what Polly is doing on this album, what the lyrical approach is, what the songs are about, and where it all comes from, if you want to really get heads or tails of this. And beyond just that fact that it is based on a novel in prose, I'm going to keep calling it Orlum, that she wrote and released a couple of years ago, it's also somewhat of a concept album. The songs on this record are basically musical retellings of the various threads of that book. And they broadly all center around this coming of age story set in Dorset, with these various motifs essentially revolving around this sort of almost paganistic lifestyle within this collective, and the perspective in particular of the central protagonist, who has this fixation on this godly figure that she refers to as Wyman Elvis. Wyman, I think, being an old Dorset word for warrior. So there's a lot going on here, and what we're not going to do is pick this apart and analyze this from a literary perspective, because that would be too involved, and that's not really what we do. But this is, I think, important to acknowledge if you want to kind of try and understand why Polly is doing what she's doing with this record, and if you have any hope of really kind of cracking into it, so to speak, you kind of do need to approach it on its own terms. And you know what? I love albums that demand that you approach them on their own terms. I love albums, particularly like in the way that this one does, that play with both lyricism and songwriting style, but also sound and sound design in ways that make it feel really different and really alien and really within their own world. And I think, in fact, that a lot of the sound design of this record and the instrumentation that Polly plays alongside her regular collaborators, John Parrish and Flood, are a huge part of the appeal of this album and are one of the things that make it both distinct but also really, really exciting to investigate. The first time I heard this, I was I was thrown around, basically. I was expecting something a little bit more abstract, esoteric, in its own level, but I wasn't expecting something that goes as far as this one does, that offers as little as this does, to a conventional listener. And that was really, really exciting for me. I feel like I should have expected that from Polly, because it feels like more and more as she's gone further into her career, each record she's put out, it's felt like a very distinct thing that comes with a lot of conceptual background and purpose and focus. And quite pivotally, every PJ record basically since To Bring You My Love really has kind of sounded very different to the one that came before it. And that's been a huge part of the way that she's developed her artistic identity, is not repeating herself. And so maybe the closest comparison for this in spirit is 2007's more pared back piano-based White Chalk. But even then, there's a whole that's me reaching to kind of force a comparison. There's really no comparison that fits very neatly for this. I want to get into what I think of this record and what appeals to me about this record and what I think is special about it. But Jake, why don't you kind of open it up a little bit here and talk about, first of all, your feelings on PJ Harvey and your approach to this record and what your kind of overall thoughts were kind of sinking into this.
Well, I don't think it's going to exactly surprise anyone when I say that I'm a really, really big PJ Harvey fan. While I haven't heard every single one of her records, she does have a great many. That sort of initial run of records like Dry through Stories from the City is like a pretty fucking untouchable run of records, if you ask me. And even some of her later stuff, like Let England Shake, for instance, to the 2011 kind of critical darling record she had, I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed stuff like the more political musings on that record. I enjoyed a return to a bit more of a straightforward kind of rockier punk blues aesthetic that she had played with a little bit earlier on in her career, but there was something a bit sharper and a bit more refined about that record that let its incisiveness really kind of hit the listener. So I was curious, of course, when I heard that there was going to be a new PJ Harvey album, just because this is pretty far into her career, and she's the kind of artist who, I mean, I guess it's really kind of telling that this is based off of like all of this poetry that she's written. And that's difficult to grapple with while listening to the album, but also it's kind of ideal, I guess, if you're a certain type of listener, because this is the exact kind of album that I really love trying to find the mystery of. It's the ideal late career album from a great artist that decides to make something challenging. It might not be too outside of their own wheelhouse, but it's wrapped in its own enigma, and it's sort of just left, and it's made for nobody but her. I was heavily reminded of Nick Cave's newer stuff, particularly Push the Sky Away, when listening to this. There's a sparse spiritualism that I feel like runs through the DNA of both of those albums, and a focus on sort of mythic iconography, that sort of deity that PJ comes back to talking about on this album, specifically in the reference to Elvis. The song Love Me Tender appears as a lyrical refrain throughout the entirety of the album. So she's playing with Americana as a mythos of sorts on this record. And while, again, I don't really have the connection to the source material that's probably required to understand everything here, I did enjoy listening to I Inside the Old Year Dying a lot, just because there's a lot of novelty in listening to someone as, I guess, storied as PJ, just being kind of abstract about everything. Like, even for her, this is a particularly difficult release to wrap your head around. And it's not just because of the peripheral content. This is difficult to describe. It's a little bit of art rock, a little bit of post rock, a little bit of slowcore, a little bit of chamber folk, a little bit of, minimalism, a lot of stuff here. On first listen, I wasn't particularly enthralled with it, but the more and more I tried to unpack this, the more and more I got out of it. And this album suffers from a very strange kind of dichotomy with me, in that it's kind of constantly fighting in between being really musically compelling and really lyrically compelling. And all of my favorite moments on it are when these two things tend to coalesce. However, it's kind of a crapshoot as to whether or not they happen at the same time. There are moments like the title track, for instance, or A Child's Question, August, where I think this coalesces at its absolute strongest, or even the final track on here, A Noiseless Noise, where things get even more esoteric and even more kind of like haunting. There's a real sinister quality to the instrumental tones on here, a kind of hollowness that just feels really disquieting to sit within. It's a very different experience than you'll get from other PJ Harvey albums, but based on the way it's written, I feel like traditional fans will still get something cathartic out of this. I just get this feeling of gradual kind of acceptance of a larger force, this idea of accepting this sort of deity that dwells within the story here and trying to come to terms with it, is a big lyrical theme on here. And I'm not sure what kind of conclusion is reached with that kind of dichotomy yet, but I can certainly say that the interplay is fascinating for the most part.
I want to start by talking about this collaboration, that this continuous collaboration that PJ Harvey is engaged in with John Parrish and Flood. Every record since 2007's White Chalk has been produced as a kind of three-way collaboration between PJ Harvey, John Parrish, and Flood. Flood also has a production credit on Is This Desire, and the trio originally started with To Bring You My Love. And so this fairly regular collaborative process has yielded, I think, so much of what I associate with PJ Harvey's records more broadly, which is that while, ever since Is This Desire, they've kind of veered in so many different directions sonically and kind of all had their own very distinct identity, this meticulousness to the arrangements and this really core sense of filling a mix has been like a huge part of the appeal of PJ's records. They're always instrumentally fascinating. However, I do feel that sort of dropped off a little bit with Hope 6 Demolition Project, which was a little bit more straightforward musically. I think there was a lot about the concept of that album, especially the kind of political edge that record had. That was really, really compelling, but there was a little bit less in that record for me to come back to. It has a little bit less longevity to it. And I'm also kind of less personally enamored with fan favorite White Chalk, although I recognize I'm very much in the minority in terms of not being in love with that record because it is one of her most beloved ones. But generally speaking, even when I don't love these records, I appreciate the depth that this collaboration brings to it, especially because between these three people, you have, so much collective talent and experience in terms of sound design and composition. And in that sense, I think that I Inside the Older Year Dying is, absolutely, it's not saying much to say it's the most compelling thing musically since Let England Shake. But I would say alongside that record, this pair, I think, represent her best work of the 21st century. I guess Stories from the City, Stories from the Sea would also be up there too, but that's such a different thing in its own lane that I want to just kind of pretend it doesn't exist for the purposes of making this point. That's the biggest thing that's been rewarding to me about I Inside the Older Year Dying, coming back to it, is appreciating how much musical intricacy and unusual but rewarding and satisfying explorations of ideas there are in the sonic makeup of this album. I emphasize that because, lyrically, I'm still really, really struggling with it. It feels like the kind of record where I would need to maybe even read Orlam, her book, to kind of get a fuller picture of the story. And I don't necessarily hold that against the record, but I kind of do as well. It's a little bit of a weird place to be in because I appreciate how this is so refuses to offer itself to the listener, but also in a certain sense, I feel a little bit alienated from it. In a certain sense, it's kind of like reading a James Joyce book. It's like reading Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake. This is an artist who is not at all interested in welcoming the listener in. This is an artist who has kind of honed their style, and their style is kind of increasingly veered further and further away from the conventional musical tradition that we've come to expect, that you just have to approach it on its own terms. And so the more I've been able to kind of get myself into that headspace, the more I've enjoyed this record. I like the idea of the general concept. I like the idea of setting this sort of coming of age story in paganist Dorset. I like some of the motifs. I like some of the refrains here. There's a little bit of Wicker Man in this. The artist I was most consistently reminded of, and again, these comparisons are much more of a spiritual than a kind of direct sonic thing, is Tom York, who I know is the biggest PJ Harvey fan in the world. Like these guys, PJ Harvey and Tom have come up together basically their entire careers, and Tom York has consistently like heaped praise on PJ Harvey at every turn. You know, he's basically her biggest advocate. Not that she needs one, but he is.
No.
Whenever you ask him, you know, what have you been listening to? What's been kind of compelling you recently? He will always bring up PJ Harvey, which I found really, really endearing and also kind of really insightful as well, because PJ Harvey's kind of distinctly, you know, influenced by this rural Southern English landscape. Like her kind of influences, I think, key into a lot of the places that a lot of the things that I think influenced Tom York as well, if in a kind of more ephemeral way. But I still think there's some kinship there, particularly in terms of solo work as well. I just think there's a lot of you know, in records like Anima or even The Eraser, and even some of the more recent stuff that he's done with The Smile, I've gotten some of the same energy, if that makes any sense, from that last Smile record that I get from this. There is a lot of very haunting and very ethereal qualities to the instrumentation here. The opening track, Prayer at the Gate, has these kind of ghostly doo-doos and these wailing kind of feedback washes, this beautifully gentle drumming from John Parrish as well. I think always a consistently underappreciated collaborator, just in terms of how much he does on each of PJ's records. Immediately, a very vivid scene is set. Maybe the most distinctive quality of this album is PJ's singing style, which is very different for her. She's lingering in this kind of nasal falsetto that sounds like a kind of, I don't know, like a distant ghost, but it's not just like that she's singing in a falsetto, but it's that it has this kind of really sort of like, you know, sort of heady quality to it. It's not like a kind of, you know, it's really hard to describe, but it's just got this distinctive character to it that feels very bucolic, you know, which is in keeping with the theme of the record. And, you know, PJ said in interviews that she basically told John Parrish and Flood, like, if you catch me singing more like PJ Harvey, you need to stop me right there, right? Because I don't want any moments of PJ Harvey on this album. She's so committed to imbuing this very specific tonality in her voice within this record. And I think a part of that for her is trying to really deepen and set the illusion of the place where the story is set, of the landscape. Like, she is trying so hard, and I think succeeding very admirably at making this record feel like it's just channeling this particular place, you know, this forgotten place, this no longer existent place at this far distant time in the past, from this very insular perspective. And so I think that that particular vocal tone, for people who are more used to the way that PJ typically sings, may be alienating. It may get to be too much at certain points. I do think there are certain songs where that falsetto, where, you know, as a consequence of what the song needs, Polly leans so hard into that falsetto that I feel that she reaches the limits of what it can do. And that's a thing that holds back some songs, I think. But this is the thing, even when there's a moment on the record where I feel like Polly's voice can't quite get there, or something's not quite hitting the mark, there's always 3 or 4 other things going on in the mix that pull it together. For this reason, I think that the moments on the record that I gravitate the least to tend to be the more sparse and typically the more folk-based tracks, like Lonesome Tonight. And I'll be clear, I don't think there are any bad songs on this record. I don't think there are any songs that completely miss the mark, but I am less compelled the more traditionally folk this sounds. I love the way that Polly creates this bucolic, archaic, you know, English countryside atmosphere using this very strange sonic toolkit, basically. You know, you brought up Nick Cave, and I think that obviously they were involved together in the 90s, and so they've kind of been brought up in conversations with each other ever since, partially as a result of that, partially because of this perception of them as these particularly troubled goths, which, you know, hilariously at around the same time in the late 90s, turn of the century, they both tried very hard to shed and have kind of
Yep.
consistently shed that ever since. But yet they still kind of get talked about in those kinds of ways because of how, set that idea of them was in the 90s. But they do get brought up together. And I did think of Nick Cave's recent work as well, but more in the sense that I was reminded of what Warren Ellis brings to those recent Nick Cave albums.
Yeah.
He's such a huge part of the sonic architecture of that recent Nick Cave material. And he loves to do these really sort of noodly and analog sounding and kind of distorted and again, sort of sometimes even flat things that he brings to those records like Carnage and records like Ghosteen and Skeleton Tree and Push the Sky Away. Those last 4 records they did together. There's elements of this record that remind me a little bit of that style too. The way in which Polly will kind of bring together these really bizarre experimentations with feedback and noise. Again, a lot of that I think comes from Flood and Parrish. I mean, they're both really, really good at kind of getting weird and strange sounds out of more conventional instruments. Polly herself has
field recordings too. The implementation of that's on here several times.
Absolutely. I mean, Polly herself has like over 12 different instrumental credits in terms of, things that she plays. She's obviously a multi-talented performer. So you've got a lot of stuff in this album. And in that sense, it feels like a very kind of slickly engineered and meticulously pieced together studio construction. You mentioned field recordings as well. There's these running water sounds that come in the song Seam and I, and this sort of groaning guitar loop pattern that I absolutely love. There are a lot of kind of burbling, kind of subdued effects, like the effect on the vocal in the song Nether Edge that makes her sound like she's kind of breathing underwater. There is a little bit of a late era Nick Cave sound to the song as well. I really like the bizarre combination of sounds on the track Autumn Term as well. Again, really nasal falsetto. This is one of the moments where I think she strains against it a little too much, but there's these beautiful piano chords that come in underneath it that again feel so Tom York to me, that really bring the whole thing together. You have moments where Polly will take a more stripped back approach to how the song's constructed, but she'll choose to mix things more harshly to kind of counteract that. So you never get a moment of peace on this album. A song like the title track is so aggressively mixed. You have this raw effect on the acoustic guitar that's so much harsher than a lot of the other effects. And then you have this strange quality on her vocal that gives it this very mystical feel, and it's all very compressed. You have a song like All Souls, which has this haunting, subdued vocal loop that's so muffled in the mix. But then Polly's voice comes through so strong and clear. And then again, these beautiful piano chords that she hits with these, bizarre like hisses of air that sound like a piston. All I'm doing is pointing out things. I have no kind of greater thesis for tying a lot of it together, but it's so enrapturing and involving. You have this shimmering, distorted guitar on the song August, not to be confused with A Child's Question August. Again, a lot of repetitive motifs in the titling here, but the song August is absolutely one of my favorite things here. The sound design of it reminds me of early Tim Hecker with this kind of crackling sort of radio static thing that reminds me of the sort of stuff that he used to do. But then you have this shimmering, distorted guitar that comes over the top with this very striking descending melody that's one of my favorite melodies on the whole album. Reminds me again a little bit of later era Tom York and a little bit of Tender Buttons era broadcast. It's a really, really unique combination of things. And I think that the closing track is, I think, the moment when I recognized how well constructed the album was when the closing track hit, because it's the best song on the album, and it also ties together basically everything the record has done musically in one way or another. It brings all of these weird ethereal swooning effects together. It gives Polly's bizarre falsetto this real sense of declarative purpose that it doesn't always have, and it kind of builds and vamps to this more traditionally rock oriented sort of sense of not climax, but just like the sense of hugeness that the most of the record kind of shies away from. So yeah, it's a weird album. I don't feel that it always necessarily sticks the landing. And I think that it's one of those things where this is absolutely greater than the sum of its parts. And like with many records we talked about in the past, the more I came to appreciate it as a totality, the more I was able to be forgiving of my limitations. So I will say that for as little as I clearly understand, the prose is beautifully constructed. Like it's obvious that Polly is a very seasoned and practiced poet. It's all very satisfying to read, and the way that she marries this very meticulously constructed and barely even English prose with this bizarre vocal performance, strange enunciations, weird emphases, makes it enhanced, in a way that definitely goes beyond what it would be like just to read. But yeah, I mean, I've kind of gone a little bit overboard there. Anything you want to kind of add there, or anything you want to jump in on?
It's not really sound wise, but I think the comparison that I came back to the most often when listening to this was actually David Tibet of Current 93.
That doesn't.
The
I get
not
it.
so much in the sound, but in the writing and its preoccupations with, deities and the whole kind of, I almost want to say, folk horror atmosphere of this. Like, if you're into the kind of aesthetic signifiers that are in things like Robert Eggers' The Witch, for instance, I feel like you're kind of gonna get that vibe going on here. And again, while it's not a direct analog for what this actually sounds like, I feel like its approach is quite similar when it comes to just sort of the raw sound design, some of those more esoteric Current 93 releases, that there is some kind of similarity between them, at least more so spiritually. And I guess the more that I listen to something like this, the more rewarding I find it, like you said. But I also do find that there is an immediate quality to this that sort of helps it get out of the gate a little bit with me, because nobody is really making music that wholly sounds anything like this. Like, this is why I think we're struggling for comparisons so often, is that it's just like, oh, it's a little bit of this, it's a little bit of that. I was also reminded, just in the way it's meticulously crafted, I was kind of reminded of a band like Talk Talk, in that it feels like so many of these compositions, no matter how minimal, are so dense in their arrangements, that it does really feel like it has that kind of Mark Hollis-esque quality to it. And while I feel a certain limitation with the record, that really only comes from the fact that, again, I feel like I don't have maybe every single piece of the puzzle. Polly Jean's lyricism throughout the years has been, different shades of accessible, and that's part of the reason why I like her. Like, you can, sort of immediately grab onto some of the stories that she tells throughout her records, and sometimes she will be talking about stuff that you will probably have a better grasp on in about 5 years from now. It's what makes her body of work so refreshing and rewarding. So I find this attempt to sort of kind of bravely delve into a more distinctly unfriendly place to be as frustrating as it is rewarding. But in many ways, I kind of love that about how artists I love just sort of use their late career as an excuse to just kind of burrow into themselves, no matter how self-indulgent their tendencies are.
Yeah, I agree. And I do think there's a kind of inherently built-in ceiling to the idea that so much of it comes from this context of this previous work that she's created in a different format. And I don't think that weakens it necessarily, but it just applies this additional inescapable bit of context that means you are going to inevitably approach it differently depending on whether you've read that book or not. And so the experience of it is going to be, different, maybe in a better way, maybe in a positive way, or maybe in a negative way. So it comes with this kind of added, you got to kind of do the reading if you want to really, really unpack it. And I don't mind that. And I think I've been trying to kind of put my finger on like exactly what the term is for the whole thing that this album is, the whole vibe it has, the theme of it, the spirit of it, whatever that is. And I think it's that it borrows a lot from magical realism, which is a really
Oh, yeah.
really fascinating kind of subgenre, more associated with literature and painting, but also something that can come through in musical art occasionally as well. I would say that some of, again, I mentioned Richard Dawson before. I'd say some of his works can kind of be ascribed in this way, although he has this kind of more I suppose more realist than magic. Maybe I'll go back on that.
Not to hammer it home too hard, but I mean, later Nick Cave, I mean, Ghostine is absolutely decorated with magical realism.
Absolutely. And so there's this idea of, it's not that, I don't think that Holly really labors the spiritualism or the kind of ethereal or the mystical all that much, but it's
No.
inarguably there, and its qualities of the kind of pagan context that this is all set in. But it does add this sharpness, and it adds this particular quality to what would otherwise be a fairly conventional coming of age character study. And so that stuff I think enhances it really, really nicely. So if any of the reference points that we have mentioned sound interesting to you, or if you've already heard the record and kind of not been all that and been kind of bewildered by it, hopefully some of what we've said will kind of help to sort of start piecing it together a bit more, because I do think it deserves that level of attention and focus. All right, let's do our favorite tracks and rating then for this new PJ Harvey album. Jake, why don't you go first?
My three favorite songs on here are going to be All Souls, A Child's Question, August, and I do have to agree, A Noiseless Noise is probably my favorite song on here as well. But I give it a very enthusiastic 6 out of 10.
My three favorite tracks on this record are Prayer at the Gates, All Souls, and A Noiseless Noise. I think I'm going to give this a tentative 7 if I had to put a number on it. It's really grown on me in the short time I've had with it. And I do think that it is one of PJ's most rich artistic statements in this form in the last couple decades, to be honest. All right, which gives us an average overall of 6.5 for PJ Harvey's Eye Inside the Old Year Dying. All right, let's move into our second review today, which is of the new album from Anohni and the Johnsons. My Back Was a Bridge for You to Cross. Now, for those of you out there who love Ryley's context giving, well, you're in for a treat, because there's a good amount of setup I want to give for this album, which is, and I'm just going to say it from the gate, I think one of the best albums of 2023 so far. So I want to do it justice, because this is a special one. Anohni and the Johnsons is the project of one Miss Anohni Hegarty, an artist who's been around for a good couple of decades, releasing music both with this project and as a solo artist as well. Anohni is a transgender artist from West Sussex who has come to, well, in the 2000s with the project Anohni and the Johnsons, came to basically command chamber pop in a huge way with a series of incredible releases, most notably 2005's just staggering I Am a Bird Now, which, as far as works of art about being transgender that I encountered at a stage of my life where I barely even knew of that as a concept for a thing you could be, retrospectively, there's few works of art that have kind of forecasted a lot of the way that my own, sense of my identity has shifted than this record does, which is an achingly sad album about self-discovery, about loneliness, about lacking in camaraderie, about trying to find camaraderie within your people. It's worth noting that the name of Anohni's band, Anohni and the Johnsons, the Johnsons in that band name is a reference to the legendary LGBT rights activist Marsha P. Johnson, whose face is actually on the cover of the album we're going to be discussing today. So there's a rich history of queerness that runs through this project, but also a history of social justice and political anger that runs through this project as well. While a record like I'm a Bird Now is more focused on the personal and the intimate, you also have Anohni's breakout solo debut outside of her band with 2016's Hopelessness, which was one of the most talked about albums within critical circles of an already incredibly stacked year. Hopelessness is a fascinating album. It's one that I listened to an awful lot that year. It's an album that was simultaneously, had praise heaped on it for how brutally direct and angry it was about issues of political violence, of suffering, of climate change, and all sorts of things like that. and simultaneously was a record that took its anger so far that it received a lot of backlash as well from people who felt that Anohni was being self-righteous or overly dramatic, or that the very true and relevant points that she was making were kind of diluted by the mode of her delivery. Particularly the fact that this record was a huge shift sonically for Anohni. Again, those Anohni and the Johnsons records are beautiful, like well orchestrated and intimate works of chamber pop, whereas Hopelessness was a brutal electro clash, glitch, synth industrial album produced by Hudson Mohawk that just has this really aggressive electronic approach to it that completely, I think, if you were someone who was familiar with Anohni's previous work, felt like, it was light years away from anything familiar. But really the same spirit of who Anohni was came through on that record. And I do think that is ultimately probably one of the most, I hate to use, it's kind of a meaningless word, but I do feel that Hopelessness is one of the most important albums of the 2010s, in the sense that the 2010s as a decade is a kind of cultural step, in the century so far. One of the defining characteristics of it was like a sharp increase of political conscience into mainstream culture. That was certainly a thing in the 2000s as well, but it felt like the way that political consciousness seeped into mainstream culture in the 2010s was much more righteous, was much more proactive, and was much more integrated with social concerns than it was in the 2000s. And so to me, Hopelessness is one of the defining works of art of the 2010s in terms of capturing what it felt like to exist in that decade, to experience culture in that decade. From the opening song, Drone Bomb Me, where Anohni is taking the perspective of a poor Middle Eastern woman begging to be drone bombed as a way of inciting this consciousness, guilt, and fear into the lives of the political class, basically, to the song 4 Degrees, where over these sort of stomping, booming bass hits and massively scratching strings, she's, screaming about climate change, to a song like Crisis, which, heartbreakingly examines the fallout of drone bombing and all that kind of thing, to a song like Watch Me, where she's talking about the age of political surveillance and WikiLeaks and all that sort of thing. There's a lot in that record, and it deserves to be kind of reapproached and reappraised, I think, for what a bold work it is, even if its bluntness and its anger goes so far that I could see it being not a very fun listening experience, to be honest. But this is just the kind of personality that Anohni has always had. This is the kind of approach that she has always wanted to bring to her art. There is no point in subtlety. There is no point in being gentle, and there is no point in approaching ugly subject matter by throwing a veil over it. The point should be to make these things bare and to communicate the emotions of these situations as richly as possible. All that is to say, this is the follow-up to Hopelessness, as well as being the follow-up to the last Johnson's album, Swan Lights. It's been... Actually, this is a nice thread with PJ Harvey. Like with the PJ Harvey record, it's been 7 years since we last heard from Anohni in a full length album format. And this is an incredible return. It is much more akin to the sound of the Johnsons record. It's a beautifully evocative and rich and atmospherically dense chamber pop record with a heavy dose of neo soul, but also a kind of traditionalist soul approach as well, with touches of slowcore and the toned down and meditative pace of these songs, but in the production and the richness of the way they're arranged, and in the, I'm going to say it, show-stopping presence of Anohni as a vocal performer. It completely lays waste to anything that she's done before. And I don't mean in terms of quality, because I think this is right up there with I'm a Bird Now. It's just as good as that record. I'm not saying it's, her previous work is shit compared to this. But what I am saying is that as a voice, as a presence, as a performer, and as an artist, Anohni is delivering stunning work here that is as good, as profound, as moving, and as satisfying as anything she's ever done. It is another incredible addition to her catalog. For as much as I think Hopelessness is a brilliant album that does a lot of really difficult but necessary things. It is also a record that is rough around the edges. It's a record that has its charms, and it's a record that has its ugliness by design. My Back Was a Bridge for You to Cross is just a consistently flooring and deeply intimately involving album that captures so much of Anohni's personality as an artist, but also has a level of restraint and a level of refinement to its orchestration, to its composition, to the way that everything is put together, that feels like a new level of craft for this artist who has been so blunt in the past, who has been so melodramatic in the past. There's very little melodrama here. There's very little moments of like, oh, let's take it higher for the sake of emphasizing, the emotion in a really blunt or crude way. There are moments on this record where it really crests into some really cathartic pieces of rising instrumentation, but the vast majority of the record shies away from doing that. And it allows what is here, it allows the band that's here, and allows Anohni as a performer to just flourish in every respect. Jake, what are your thoughts on this very striking album?
My only familiarity with Anohni before this album, in fact, was us doing our Björk retrospective,
Yes.
where she appeared on her album Volta.
And Volnakira.
Distinct highlights of those experiences. And I was curious when I saw that, she had put out an album, but this was sort of added to our schedule a little bit last minute. So that contributes heavily to my opinion here when I say that it's not that I didn't expect anything good out of this, but I could certainly say this is one of the most blindsiding experience that I had with anything this year, because wow, you weren't kidding when you said it was one of the best of the year. Holy shit, this absolutely floored me. And I think it's for a couple of reasons, namely that first off is the immediacy of the soul vibe that she's bringing to the table that's often inflected with elements of blues. There are often times on here where particularly the backing band will call to mind Jimi Hendrix or something like more traditional classic rock influences on here, as well as adding that kind of texture to some of the more slowcore elements on songs like Sliver of Ice or Can't, for instance. And like you said, the vocal performances on here are just as show-stopping as they were as she was on those Björk records. This is full of these deep, soulful, longing, mournful performances that are just exquisite to bear witness to. I mean, like, there are several moments where the intimacy of this album very pointedly made me feel uncomfortable. And I don't say that as something that like detracts from the experience at all. I think it's meant to be confronting. There's several instances on here where for instance, one of the best songs on here, which is Scapegoat, becomes so brazenly honest. Like, in the periphery, I can understand the kind of issues somebody could have with this. And I've also seen this record criticized so far for being not even just melodramatic, but being kind of doomery, for lack of a better word. And I find those criticisms to be a bit short-sighted and also just kind of like a bit tone deaf, honestly. Like the honest, and I'll say it, very distinctly queer sense of despair on here. I mean, yes, it's confronting, it's uncomfortable, but it's also honest, it's gorgeous, and frankly it's necessary to get this out for sake of catharsis, just trying to deal with it. That's the sort of overall tone that I feel this album is grappling with. It's just externalizing these issues that are forced to be internalized by so many. It's getting it out in a wail of grief, and it's just it's captivating. And there are those moments, again, like I think the first moment that truly caught me off guard was Scapegoat, where she very honestly confronts issues, namely that of things like homophobia and transphobia, where these things become so unignorable that it just, if you don't already feel the pain inherent with these issues and topics that Anohni is singing about, then you're going to feel them through her. And that's a very powerful channeling. She's this serving as this kind of, as if all of these issues are being sort of channeled into one singular kind of tableau that's just sort of expressing how these things make somebody who is affected by all of them very directly feel. And it's channeled into the album's like best moments, just all of the songs on here proper, incredible pop soul balladries that just, they're stunning. All of them, every single one of them, be it because of the instrumentation, be it because of the performances, be it because of the interplay of the two. You're going to get an absolute treat here that I also think is bizarrely quite accessible. Like, this is an album that, yes, it deals in a lot of difficult topics, but like sonically, you could play this for your mom and she would enjoy it, which is kind of fascinating, just because I'm very used to familiar, contemporary, often very queer art being very maximalist in its approach and being very difficult, containing lots of rough edges. And we celebrate that kind of stuff on here all of the time. And it's because that kind of stuff has a sort of synergy with the way that it's experienced, and it's put together in often very meticulous, very immediate ways. But the accessibility here just sort of allows you into a very specific window of a very specific kind of world experience that Anohni, as a trans woman, has that a lot of us don't have. And I find it both alluring and very cathartic, and just, again, so singularly captivating in how fucking beautiful it is. I am never going to forget the final minute and a half of what I think is album highlight, Rest, which I mean, I felt physically as though I was dying in the final minute of this song. It is this upward reaching, soulful imploring of just this showcase of grand instrumental virtuosity that just, it feels like a spotlight is suddenly shining on you, and it threatened to literally bring me to my fucking knees with its power. And the best thing I can say about this album is that even on moments that aren't this incredible high point, that power is manifested tangibly into basically every single thing on here. Even the more interstitial moments that are, like the less than 2 minute long tracks on here serve as interesting textural flourishes that really do add something to the record that gives it a bit of connective tissue. Like, Go Ahead, for instance, isn't my favorite thing on here, but it provides this really abrasive guitar texture to the experience that feels like it's forecasting what's to come throughout the rest of the album, both tonally in a musical sense and tonally in the lyricism and the way it's confronted. I'm stunned by this whole thing.
I like your singling out of the song Scapegoat, which is also, I mean, in as much as there can be highlights in this album for me, I think the whole album is a highlight. I think it's just so beautifully constructed in almost every respect. But that song is a notable one, I think, because it's one of the ones where you get I guess, the strongest sense of the kind of writer Anohni has become known for being. The kind of style that she adopted on Hopelessness, on songs like Drone Bomb Me, where she highlights the reality of hate violence by imbuing the song from the perspective of the victim and basically encouraging that violence. Or alternately, imbuing the song from the perspective of the perpetrator and basically revealing the violence to be as two-dimensional and meaningless and senseless as it actually is, a form of blank catharsis. And this is a style that Anohni has adopted in the past before. She is, and one of the things that I think gives her a sense of identity as a writer, but also introduces a limitation that some people have with her. I mean, you mentioned the kind of doomerism that some people have kind of mentioned in association with this album. I think I agree that that accusation is limited, because this record, I think, has a bit more hope and a bit more of a sense of catharsis and of productive pain inside of it than people are often willing to give it credit for. But it is worth admitting that, her previous work in albums like Hopelessness, for instance, they do imbue that perspective pretty strongly. That's a cathartic album in part because it is sort of relinquishes to the sense that we're out of hope and there is no way of fixing this. And that's one of the things that made people, I think, take issue with that record. But it's an aspect of Anohni's brutal, cathartic style that makes her album so effective. And I think once you view it within the lens of the other works that she's done, you see that this isn't really how she feels all the time, and this isn't her philosophy. She's not a nihilist, but she does feel so broken down and so beaten by how difficult the necessary change she sees seems to be, that it can get to that place. But I think it's pointed to kind of respond to that side of herself by opening the album with a song like It Must Change, where it's just a flat rejection of that fatalism. You know, here, Anohni is putting forward the idea that everything is not doomed because change must happen. Not that it will, but that it simply has to. It is an inevitability. It is just, you know, the subtext that Anohni doesn't necessarily mention explicitly is what that will come at the cost of and what will be necessary to get there. But what Anohni is foregrounding is that change must happen. It's a beautifully straightforward and really to the point song. The way you talk to me, it must change. The things you do to me, the way you leave me, the seeds you give to me, it must change. The death inside you that you pass into me. The truth is that I always thought you were beautiful in your own way. That's why this is so sad. She's not hiding anything, and she's immediately getting you to confront the messy emotional realities of a dynamic of perpetrator and victim, of violence inflicted and violence received. This is something that she's always been really, really potent at communicating. You know, my favorite Anohni and the Johnson song is Fistful of Love off of Bird Now. And that's just such a brutal song that blurs the lines, that explores like violence in a sexual dynamic and completely blurs the lines between whether this is consensual S&M violence or just an abusive relationship where the recipient of the violence has accepted that that is love. And this complicated relationship that we have between violence, between victimhood and perpetratorhood, between hate and love, for lack of a better, more nuanced dynamic than that, has kind of been something that's been at the core of the way Anohni is written forever. But the character that she brings to this record, the sense with which that weariness is coupled with I guess a sense of worldly understanding that makes it feel richer and more emotionally nuanced than previous Anohni records. You know, when I think of her previous music, I think of despondence in general. And while there is that element of being brutally broken down here, I mean, particularly in the most Anohni type beat song on here, which is Why Am I Alive Now, you still have this sense of imbued understanding of the nature of reality, basically, that it isn't inherently evil, that things in the world and the systems that we live under aren't necessarily inherently evil, that everything is corruptible and that everything is changeable, and that everything exists in a state of possibility, basically. Nothing has to be the way that it is. There is always a way to change. There is always a way to improve, whether it's systems, whether it's people, whether it's whatever it is. And Anohni's, I guess, expansion of her philosophy to more broadly reflect that makes this, I think, one of her most satisfying records, if not the most satisfying record. I mean, I haven't decided whether I like this or Bird Now more. They're both equally masterpieces. But this record has this depth of view that feels really like something Anohni has been building towards, perhaps as a product of living, perhaps as a product of honing her craft, of expressing herself more freely. One of the most moving songs on the record, maybe the most moving song on the record to me, is Sliver of Ice, which is, I think, one of the most emotionally impactful songs Anohni has ever written, which is saying something. The idea of this song, of discovering a capacity to love, discovering a capacity to enjoy and feel a sense of meaning and beauty in life for the first time in a long time, maybe ever, comes through so powerfully in this song. And I mean, Anohni has this rich voice that's able to kind of really kind of project these strong feelings and this strong sense of comfort and sadness and all these emotional tones that she nails. But I love the fragility that underlies that really confident tone. There's always a slight waver. There's a slight thing that's kind of that she can use, that she can channel to just add this little extra layer to the emotion. That it's not necessarily confident, but that there's always this lingering fear or this lingering doubt or this lingering worry that's kind of sinking at the back. And the way that those emotions are so subtly but so beautifully and powerfully at the same time imbued into a song like Sliver of Ice just floors me completely. I love these rich but stately soul and blues oriented instrumentals. I think that they're so well conceived, and they're given balance by the moments where the band do kind of vamp a bit and where the band do kind of build up to something a bit larger. In songs like Can't, for instance, which has this just real rush of energy to the instrumentation, the way that it builds in that chorus and the way that it intensifies as it goes on. And of course, the song you've already mentioned as your favorite on the record, and honestly, probably mine as well, just for how fantastically it integrates everything the rest of the album does, Rest, which, whew, I mean, God, if we're not talking about this Songs of the Year time, and six and
Yeah, I was gonna
5
say.
months, then something will have gone horribly wrong, because this is an incredible piece of music, especially with that She'll Come Home refrain at the end, as the whole band have just kind of escalated to this colossal peak. It's something special. It's something so special.
I think that one of the reasons I don't find her lyricism overbearing on here is that when tackling these topics in the way that she's tackling them, I guess I just don't see the point in compromising. Like, I feel like that's just sort of doing the situation, be it, lamenting isolation and depression, talking about what it is for the state of queer people right now, talking about climate change, talking about, vulnerability, talking about, survivor's guilt, or, the loss of friends. All of these things are issues that I feel like artists, again, in particular queer artists, they shouldn't have to pussyfoot around what they're about. Like, confronting these honestly is really the best way to do them, especially in the way that Anohni does throughout the course of the album. And I feel like that's what the honesty does. Like, it might take you off guard when you initially hear a song, again, like Scapegoat, for instance, which has very blunt, very, very just like honest lyricism that's just, it doesn't make heads or tails about anything. You might be a little bit off put by how almost angular that feels, and to contrast with how smooth the rest of the sound of the song is. But it's that contrast that I think makes for an important effect of just something that is essentially uncomfortable about this album that, for the large part, sounds very comfortable. The influence of sort of classic soul singers, particularly that of Nina Simone, I feel like can be found on here. Like those like really kind of classic traditional voices that are, backed by production that didn't really sound, a million miles away from what we're presented with here. That sort of idea of evoking classic sounds, classic singers, classic voices, and combining it with the modernity of, contemporary issues and feelings, it feels like it has a timelessness to it when you have that sort of forward reaching and backward reaching contrast that sort of meet in the moment and make this feel very vital and singular. And simultaneously, again, it's cathartic in how it acknowledges hopelessness, but it doesn't exactly disregard the idea of progress. Again, like you said on the opening track, for instance, it's a song that's about the inevitability of change. It's not talking about change as though it is an innately positive force, but just that it is a universal constant that changes like gravity. We're eventually going to get along that line. And I find that to be basically the most honest and realistic outlook to have about where we are right now, just generally speaking, in that, better times are yet to come, but that doesn't exactly make the present any easier to deal with.
Absolutely. Even though this is the first Anohni and the Johnsons album since 2010 Swanlights, I do find that it exists pretty well in a dialogue with 2016's Hopelessness. A lot of the perspectives that that record offered, and I won't dig into them too much already, I've already highlighted enough, are, I feel like, responded to or in some ways revisited with a new perspective on this album. I mean, you compare a song like 4 Degrees on that record, which is just the screed of anger at the impending climate apocalypse, and you compare that to a song like There Wasn't Enough on this record, which is, I think, one of the most, it's still fairly oblique, but it is to me quite clearly about climate change and the state of the earth and resource allocation, all those kinds of things. And it is this lament in a similar way that 4 Degrees is a lament, but it's less, it finds ways to be equally as scathing without being pure vitriol and nothing else. And I don't say that to denigrate 4 Degrees, because its pure vitriol is very cathartic, but there is a sense of scathing energy in this song towards those figures with authority who clamber for more, who engage in excess and damn the consequences. And there is an appeal to that perspective, not a sense of understanding it or agreeing with it or being thoroughly empathetic with it, but there is in a sense of trying in a more meaningful way to appeal to that and to speak to that and to address that in a way that doesn't back down from Anohni's strongly held beliefs either. It's just a more emotionally complex way of addressing the same issue. And so I think that in all the respects that Hopelessness is blunt and aggressive and brutal and vitriolic and completely on the nose about everything, this record approaches a lot of the same ideas with a more balanced perspective. And that's not a balance in the sense of both sides, but just in the sense of understanding and imbuing reality and the gravity of how we all actually engage with these things in a way that feels a bit more, I don't know, close to home, a bit easier to engage with anyway. It's not that one approach is any less or more valid than the other. It's just that this approach feels like a response to the previous record in a way that enhances it for me as well. And Anohni flirts with that, with that despondence, with that sense of hopelessness again on this record in tracks like It's My Fault and Why Am I Alive Now? But that's always part of a dialogue within the album where she is asking these questions internally and then responding to them. Why Am I Alive Now is in a dialogue with the closing track, which answers that question as to be free, to survive, basically. And survival in itself is a noble goal and is a step forward that can be imbued with any level of meaning that you want to bring to it, that is not inherently flawed or that is not inherently pointless. And that is me explaining that is only going to trivialize it, because it's something that by explaining it and breaking it down, the power in how it lands is just lost by necessity. But that's what it is. And that's why the album has to be experienced, I think, so that you can get that moment where you hit that final track, where you hit that resolution of that tension and of that racked sense of despondency. And it allows you to experience the catharsis of Anohni's previous work, of confronting the darkness and the hopelessness, but it also offers you a way to use that and offers you a way forward with it, which I think makes it an essential record in 2023.
I found this to be a deeply gratifying and weirdly soothing experience, for as uncomfortable and for as alarming as a lot of it feels. It became to be a bit of a salve for me for this week. So I would say that I completely co-sign the take that this is an absolute must-hear for everyone this year, no matter who you are.
All right, let's do our favorite tracks and ratings then for this particular album. I'll go first this time. My 3 favorites, if I had to pick only 3, I would pick Sliver of Ice, Scapegoat, and Rest. It's a great record, one of the year's best, a very strong 8.5 from me with high potential to climb up to even higher than that.
I'm going to say my three favorites here are Scapegoat, Sliver of Ice, and favorite song on here is definitely Rest, and 8 out of 10. Fantastic album.
All right, which gives us an average overall of 8.3 for Anohni and the Johnsons. My Back Was a Bridge for You to Cross. Let us know at home what you think of either of the albums we've discussed today. PJ Harvey's I Inside the Old Year Dying, or Anohni and the Johnsons' My Back Was a Bridge for You to Cross. Want to hear your thoughts, want to hear your perspectives, want to hear your takes on where these records land in the context of these artists' greater bodies of work, what you think of the concepts, what you think of the songs, what you think of the execution, any thoughts you want to share on these records and what we've had to say about them would be greatly appreciated, and we will respond to you in the comments below. If you really enjoyed this and want to support us even more for just $1 a month, you can hit the join button and you can become a member of the Jams and Tea family. Get your name in the title call of every video on this channel. Plus, if you want to recommend us something to listen to and talk about in our Now episodes, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. Until next time though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Bounty, the quicker picker-upper.